This document is a declassified memorandum of conversation between US President Bill Clinton and Russian President Boris Yeltsin. It takes place in Istanbul during the 1999 OSCE summit. During this conversation, at some point, Boris Yeltsin says,
"I ask you one thing. Just give Europe to Russia. The US is not in Europe. Europe should be the business of Europeans. Russia is half European and half Asian."
So you want Asia too?
Sure, Bill. Eventually, we will have to agree on all of this.
I don't think the Europeans would like this very much.
Not all, but I'm a European. I live in Moscow. Moscow is in Europe and I like it. You can take all the other states and provide security to them. I will take Europe and provide them security. Well, not I. Russia will.
These relations were never easy. Nor were they predictable, stable, or based on trust.
The maxim is, doviai no proviai. Trust but verify.
It was, however, a necessary relationship.
Do I trust him? Yeah, I trust him.
Russia's relations with the West.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
In 1991, the world looked at Russia with a newfound optimism.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom.
The Soviet Union had collapsed and the Russian Federation had become an independent state. There was an opportunity to change relations and establish a new position between the Russian Federation and the Western states. 30 years later, Russia is not only waging a full-scale war in Europe. Today, the West is its greatest enemy. How did this happen? Why is Russia hostile to the West? In this film, we try to answer this question. Chapter 1. The Base and the Superstructure.
14 years in the making, and today, finally, McDonald's threw open the doors to its first restaurant in Moscow.
When the first McDonald's was opened in the Soviet Union in Moscow in January 1990,
today these Russians wanted it all. 30,000 of them, twice what anyone expected, crammed through the golden arches before the day was done.
The queue to this McDonald's broke a Guinness World Record. It was almost 2 hours long.
Soviets are used to standing in long lines for just about anything.
And within the first 24 hours, this McDonald's was visited by around 30,000 people. This was a very visceral, literal expression of this hunger for the West.
Because I'm hungry.
There was a group of people who became successful in Russia. There was quite a large group of those who made it big during this time, generally illegally, but not only this way. There was a group of those who felt the freedom, the new opportunities and possibilities. They really believed that the Russian dream was about to come true. But getting to the Russian dream was no picnic. The last General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, began reforms that irreversibly changed the Soviet Union. The process of perestroika, or reconstruction, and glasnost, or openness, paved the way for the historic changes facing the Russian authorities and society. Reality was changing fast. On December 25, 1991, the flag of the USSR is replaced by the flag of the new Russian Federation. The Cold War, which lasted since 1947, had come to an end. The whole world was watching what would happen in Russia. And even then, the road to a capitalist and democratic Russia seemed inevitable.
Rosja się zreformowała. To nie jest prawda, że...
Russia has reformed. It's not true that it has not changed. These reforms, however, in their final form went in a completely different, one could say, opposite direction than some had hoped for, meaning in an authoritarian and then basically neo-totalitarian direction.
The economic reforms were intended to change the centrally planned economy that Russia had inherited from the Soviet Union into a market economy. They became known as shock therapy, and indeed were very costly for the Russian society. The liberalization of prices, the reduction of subsidies to unprofitable state-owned companies, trade liberalization or privatization are just some of them. In the short term, their effect was hyperinflation, companies going bankrupt, unemployment, and a lack of access to certain goods. For ordinary Russians, it was a turn for the worst, and this period is known as the Wild 90s. At the same time, there was a group that got rich, and quickly. The oligarchs were close to power, and through this and wild privatization, sometimes for next to nothing, took over prospective Russian industries, mainly the country's raw materials. Crisis and economic collapse. This is how this period functions in the consciousness of Russian society, still today.
W ślad za tym szły też poważne zmiany polityczne.
This was also followed by major political changes, but right from the start, the introduction of democratic structures and institutions in Russia was associated with a power struggle, a personal struggle in which these emerging institutions simply became tools in that struggle. The experiment with transforming the still former Soviet institutions into fully democratic ones led to serious political polarization and conflicts around the various centers of power. The Russian parliament on the one hand and the presidential center on the other became such centers. And the events of the autumn of 1993 were a certain culmination of this conflict, when there was something like a short-lived civil war in Russia and bloodshed in the streets of Moscow.
O słabości Związku Sowieckiego w tamtych latach.
The weakness of the Soviet Union in those years was demonstrated by the failed 1991 coup attempt. It was a political event that showed how supposedly strong state structures immediately stop working when there is no permanent political center.
In the space of 3 years, Russia underwent 2 unsuccessful coups that shaped the country's further development. In August 1991, the Yanayev coup was the last attempt to maintain the USSR. By government buildings. This dangerous situation was then disarmed by Boris Yeltsin himself. In the end, the army was under the leadership of the putschists for only 3 days. 2 years after the events of the August coup, Boris Yeltsin himself was at the center of a power struggle with the institution of parliament over the shape of the future Russian constitution. Tanks were again driven into the streets, and on the president's orders, the house of the government of the Russian Federation, the White House, was shelled. The struggle was between the president and the chairman of the Russian parliament, Ruslan Khasbuatov, and vice president, Alexander Rutskoy. At stake was the future shape of the political system in Russia, but also ongoing reforms in the country. As a result of hostile actions on both sides, the military was deployed to quell protests against the president. On October 4th, the parliament building was shelled. These clashes, known as the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis, are also sometimes called the Second October Revolution. The street fighting in Moscow resulted in the highest number of people killed since 1917. Officially, 147 people were killed. Unofficially, as many as 800. Shock therapy, social inequality, soaring crime, and lawlessness were happening against a backdrop of weak leadership in the country. Reforms were progressing, but their effects did not yet have a positive outcome. Boris Yeltsin, who came to power under the slogans of democratizing Russia, over time began to share his power with the oligarchs and those closest to him, his daughter Tatiana Dyachenko and her future husband Valentin Yumashev. When Yeltsin's health began to deteriorate, especially in his second term, it was Tanya and Valia, in partnership with the oligarchs who seized power in Russia with their own interests at heart. They were the ones who selected Vladimir Putin to be Russia's next president, initiating Russia's return to its authoritarian roots.
And that gave rise to a public demand for strongman rule, for someone to come in and put things in order, someone who will ensure basic stability.
I think that all of this led to the failure of democracy in Russia, and it could not succeed with such a damaged society, with the legacy of the Soviet Union and the subsequent decisions of the elites. This is a very difficult process, and one that requires consistent work at the political level, at the social level, and for decades and generations to come. And unfortunately, Russia backed away from these reforms too quickly for them to be effective. The transformation of its former adversary was closely watched by the Western world, especially the United States. They followed developments on the one hand hoping for, if not a rapid, then at least a stable evolution of the Soviet Union into a liberal democracy, while on the other hand they feared armed clashes, violence, escalating chaos, and unpredictable consequences.
W Rosji współczesnej
There is a myth in contemporary Russia that claims that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the result of a great conspiracy by the West, led, of course, by the United States, whose aim from the beginning was to weaken it, to bring about a crisis and then to disintegrate and permanently eliminate its adversary in the form of the Soviet state. This is a myth, and it's untrue because the West actually feared the collapse of the Soviet Union. It made some political efforts to, if not stop this process, then at least slow it down or moderate it.
The possibility of using nuclear weapons remained a key issue. At the time, Russia and 14 other countries had 35,000 nuclear weapons of various caliber in thousands of locations across Eurasia. Gorbachev could count on the support of the West and the US. It was believed that sooner or later, Russia would go the way of the other Eastern Bloc countries. Nevertheless, the negative social impact of the reforms was viewed with concern. Russia's GDP fell by 45% between 1989 and 1998. By comparison, this kind of temporary recession in the other Central European countries saw falls between 20 and 30% and lasted between 2 and 4 years.
Najważniejsze z punktu widzenia Zachodu.
It was understood that these reforms could not threaten a social explosion that would lead to either some kind of complete chaos or a return to an aggressive path or even communist recidivism. Let's remember that at the very beginning in 1992-1993, the communist and nationalist political forces were very strong in Russia. The West was afraid that especially the communists from the transformed Communist Party of the Russian Federation, would return to power and reverse this whole process of economic reforms, or that it could turn towards an anti-Western foreign policy. And that's why there was a very wide margin of tolerance for the not always democratic and sometimes even anti-democratic actions of the new Russian authorities, which were seen as a certain inevitable political cost of making it a priority to stop the risk of political recidivism in the new Russia.
The West believed that the most important thing was to ensure that the Russian economy was reborn on new capitalist principles. All the rest of the processes were, at least temporarily, less important. The dominant belief was that if the economic transformation of the base was achieved, if capitalism was introduced and the means of production were in the hands of private owners, then the political and social system, that is, the superstructure, would, with some delay, but automatically, also change.
Well, the Russian elite never accepted this view of the world and this view of political economic logic, and it remained with this, I would say, Marxist-Leninist view of the world, which is a struggle in which all relations, even cooperation, is competition and a way of struggle, just as in the 70s the Soviet Union treated détente as another form of class struggle with global capitalism.
This belief was particularly strong in Germany, which believed that through these ties, the Russian elite would see the benefits of this cooperation, and that they would be so great that all conflicts would be avoided. This was supposed to be the golden mean to avoid conflict between Russia and the West, and the European Union. Because, after all, countries who trade together stay together. The German belief in the strength of economic ties became the foundation of EU policy towards Russia, and the Americans based their policy on similar principles. In 2008, the EU was Russia's largest trading partner, accounting for 52% of all Russian foreign trade. 75% of foreign direct investment in Russia also came from the EU. Europe mainly imported Russian raw materials. 86% of Russian exports to the EU were energy and fuel supplies. In 2011, Nord Stream 1 is launched to transport Russian gas from Russia to Germany.
Стабильно и бесперебойно. Это мы гарантируем.
Nord Stream has strikingly shown that the state and the private sector can form a constructive and productive unit across several national borders. We can be proud of this truly European collaboration.
Dürfen wir zu Recht stolz sein. It is operational until August 2022. In 2012, Russia joins the World Trade Organization, and 2 years later annexes Crimea. As it turned out, the effects of this economic policy towards Russia had the opposite effect. This attitude showed the Russian elite that they could have it all, the benefits of cooperation without the price to pay for them.
Ta polityka była kontynuowana tak naprawdę.
This policy actually continued until 2022. That is, until the attack on Ukraine. Because, let's recall, even something as symbolic as Nord Stream 2, it was built, and the decision to do that was taken after the annexation of Crimea and after Russia had intervened militarily in eastern Ukraine in 2014. All of that was accepted, sucked up, and this hope that these economic ties, this economic interdependence is a cure for Russian geopolitical revisionism. It survived all the way until 2022.
The collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War opened up new opportunities to redefine Russia-NATO relations. NATO was established in 1949, one of its aims being to provide a counterbalance and defense against a potential attack by the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allied states. Membership in the organization was like an insurance policy. And although the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, NATO members were not about to give up the protection they could receive from the organization, especially in the first unpredictable years after the collapse of the USSR. However, a change of approach was needed on both sides. The key questions concerned the newly formed Russian Federation, but also the former states of the USSR and the Eastern Bloc. Interestingly, Russia did not initially reject the idea of NATO membership. What is more, on at least a few occasions, it suggested that such a prospect would be possible. The first such signal was President Yeltsin's letter to the leaders of NATO countries in December 1991, when the Russian Federation was taking over political representation, including in relations with the West, from the disintegrating Soviet Union.
W tym liście było sformułowanie o tym, że
There was a sentence in that letter about NATO membership, that it constitutes a prospective goal of the Russian Federation. The Russian side insisted afterwards that this was the result of an error by a stenographer who simply forgot to add the word not. Does not constitute instead of constitutes. The fact is that the new Russia was considering how best to fit into the emerging new political order in Europe. Russia wanted to be part of that order and wanted to be an important part of it. Even though it was extremely weak, it still thought of itself as a superpower.
Russia wanted to become the heir to the Soviet Union's superpower status. Then and later, Moscow signaled its readiness to discuss membership prospects in the alliance on several occasions. In the mid-1990s, in the early 2000s under Putin, and even after Dmitry Medvedev took over after 2008. However, we must immediately deconstruct how Russia imagined its role in NATO.
To tak naprawdę oznaczało, że Rosja
What this really meant was that Russia was suggesting to the West, to the US, to the NATO member states, that it would be good for them to make a political decision to allow Russia into the creation of the European security order on a fully even-handed basis, with a right to effectively veto decisions and co-decision-making powers on key European security issues. At the same time, it was clearly suggested that Russia had no intention of entering into the military structures of the alliance, and this was more in expert conversations, because in political talks, things rarely went that far, and Russia was not going to carry out deep reforms, including of its security structures, the defense structures of the army, exactly according to Western guidelines, meaning it was not going to adapt. Of course, it was pursuing various reforms, but it claimed that it was doing it as a sovereign state, according to its own rules, and it was not going to adapt to the standards of regimes according to ready-made models that were dictated by the United States and that were binding for allied states.
Russian proposals can therefore be seen as a certain ploy. Russia implied that it wanted to be part of a NATO-based order, but was not prepared to take real steps towards integration. It was an attempt to drag NATO into an arrangement in which Russia, while not a member, sought to gain co-participation and decision-making powers within the alliance. Russia has always viewed NATO as an organization in which member states are subordinate to the United States. In Russian political culture, this is what the word alliance means: the subordination of weaker partners to stronger ones. Successive rounds of NATO enlargement to include new member states were therefore not a question of Russia's security.
Elita rosyjska, która patrzyła na politykę międzynarodową,
the Russian elite looked at international politics unequivocally in geopolitical terms. That is, it could not help but think about it in terms of spheres of influence. It saw the accession of Central European states to NATO primarily as a mechanism to prevent Russia from rebuilding its sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe in the future. This was not said explicitly, of course, but that was the real reason. Russia protested, talked about its security interests, but the real reason was just that. This was particularly clear in the alternatives to the security of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which Russia was then proposing. And it was proposing a collective security arrangement which did not really oblige anyone to anything in terms of providing assistance, but which automatically gave an advantage and dominance to those with military clout. And in Central and Eastern Europe, this actor was always Russia.
NATO provided Russia with a number of security guarantees, one of which was the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, in which NATO guaranteed that no nuclear weapons or significant combat forces would be stationed in the newly admitted states, and NATO respected this commitment. The number of troops and equipment did not change in numbers, and no new troops appeared on Russia's border.
To zostało uzupełnione w ramach, zupełnie to było, moim zdaniem, to było...
Although no one spoke about it out loud at the time, it was obvious that such a legally binding guarantee for the Russian side would also be provided by the new, adapted version of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, which was negotiated between 1995 and 1999. It already imposed legal obligations on the new NATO states, which prevented them from receiving and stationing on their territory so-called significant combat forces of third countries, even allied ones, which again was a mechanism to prevent the possibility of concentrating forces for some entirely theoretical attack on Russia. Not to mention, of course, that Russia is, after all, a nuclear power, and it never occurred to anyone in the West to start a war with a nuclear power or to attack a nuclear power.
Throughout the years and stages of NATO enlargement, mechanisms for political dialogue between Russia and the alliance were in place. First within the NATO-Russia Permanent Joint Council, and then the NATO-Russia Council. Russia was not given the right to veto alliance decisions, but it was able to decide joint initiatives together with member states, and expanded its ability to exert political influence over NATO members. It also joined more international organizations, the International Monetary Fund, the G7 and the World Trade countries. And the West begins to disarm. Over the years, the military budgets of Western countries begin to decrease. In the United States by a few percent, and in Europe they sometimes drop as low as 1%. More proof that Russia did not feel threatened militarily by NATO was the decision in 2007 to suspend Russian participation in the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. No country that feels threatened militarily abandons such a treaty.
I w związku z tym te żądania, które Rosja...
And therefore, these demands that Russia put forward towards the Americans in December 2021, January 2022, before the war with Ukraine, they were just such a formal and official overt demonstration of what Russia's objectives towards NATO really are. This is also where we see Russia's belief that either it will be able to defeat this NATO, force the US to revise its global policy, or Russia will not survive.
Te relacje były, natomiast Rosja...
This was a relationship between Russia and NATO, but Russia was de facto treating this cooperation as a counterweight to the process of NATO's enlargement, which it saw as being against its interests. And why was it doing this? Not because it felt threatened by NATO. This is also something of a myth, because of course Russia has spoken and speaks constantly about how threatened it is, and how its security interests are being undermined by NATO. But on the other hand, the real motivation for these Russian actions was simply a reluctance to come to terms with the permanent nature of geopolitical change in Europe. That is, with the fact that the former states belonging first to the Soviet bloc, and then those formed after the collapse of the Soviet Union, had the right to pursue an independent foreign and security policy, including membership in Western alliances, and NATO was the most important Western political military alliance. And it did this because it recognized, not without basis, that such a situation would, in a sense, permanently block Russia's possibility of reconquest, the possibility of rebuilding its influence and taking control of those states, of their politics, or forcing the post-Soviet states to integrate into Russian-controlled political, economic, and military structures. So this was the real reason for Russia's continuing campaign against NATO's eastern enlargement, not the mythical fear of a NATO threat.
To jest troszkę taka strategia.
It's a bit of an all-or-nothing strategy. There's a Russian proverb, ili pan, ili propal, that you are either a master or you are a slave.
The conversation between Clinton and Yeltsin finishes abruptly. Boris is tired and slightly irritated with the way it's going. Clinton, however, manages to ask his last question.
Who will win the election?
Putin, of course. He will be the successor to Boris Yeltsin. He's a Democrat and he knows the West.
He's very smart.
He's tough. He has an internal ramrod, he's tough internally, and I will do everything possible for him to win. Legally, of course. And he will win. You'll do business together. He will continue the Yeltsin line on democracy and economics and widen Russia's contacts. He has the energy and the brains to succeed. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Boris. It was good to see you.
Chapter 2. Vladimir and the Russian Federation. To almost everyone's surprise, at the end of 1999, Boris Yeltsin steps down as president and appoints Vladimir Putin, the incumbent prime minister and former head of the FSB, as his successor. On March 26, 2000, Putin wins the election with 53% of the vote, a marginal lead that allowed him to avoid a runoff. Russia forever changes course. Still in 2000, a scenario in which Putin remains at the helm of power for 25 years would have caused consternation or be considered a joke. He may have lacked the experience or qualifications for the position, but he was young, eloquent, and quite literally sober-minded. For ordinary Russians, Vladimir Putin's image was a great change, not only from Boris Yeltsin himself, but from the entire political apparatus of the 1990s. At least at first, he may have seemed like a Russian everyman. He was like you and me. He was modest, low-key, and most importantly, he promised to rebuild the Russian state. Putin's initial declarations of a willingness to cooperate with the West, to respect civil society, to support economic and political freedom, have given way over time to assets grabbing by his newly formed court. Circumstances were favorable for the Russian authorities. High prices of oil and gas on the world markets between 2000 and 2008 allowed Putin to further consolidate power and his influence. Some of the economic reforms initiated in the 1990s continued and began to bear fruit. The period between 1998 and 2008 was an unprecedented era of growth in Russia. During this period, the Russian GDP had an annual growth rate of 7%. The private sector benefited from these market dynamics and was also growing. Indeed, Russians, at least for a moment, had the good life. Under Putin, Russia joins international organizations, cooperates on security issues on the continent, and Putin himself is welcomed at international gatherings like a dear friend of Western heads of state.
Vladimir and I just had a very constructive dialogue, particularly about missile defense.
His presidency inspires undying optimism.
I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy.
But the question is whether Putin ever actually wanted Russia to become an equal state among the Western liberal democracies.
Nie sądzę, żeby Putin kiedykolwiek myślał o tym, aby Rosja...
I don't think Putin ever thought about Russia becoming part of the West, in the sense of not just belonging to formal Western structures, but in the sense of something more profound, i.e. some fundamental change in the political, economic system that would make Russia a Western state. There were very few people in Russia at all among the intellectual elite who thought in such terms. The dominant view, and this was among the people around Putin it seems, was that Russia is a kind of separate, distinct entity. It is neither part of the West nor part of the East. It is a kind of independent center and should remain that way. But Putin himself stressed, and he obviously said many things depending on who he was talking to. If he spoke to Westerners, especially to certain representatives of the intellectual elite, then in the first period of his first tenure, he sometimes stressed that Russia is a country of European culture, a country with deep historical ties to Europe. It is simply a part of Europe, a very important part of Europe. And Putin seems to have had a vision of Russia cooperating with the West, but cooperating on its own terms, i.e., first and foremost, that this requirement from the West was the recognition of Russian power and the actual, not necessarily formal, recognition of the Russian sphere of influence in the so-called post-Soviet area in the first instance, but also of certain Russian interests in other regions, and consequently, allowing Russia to co-determine key political and security issues, primarily on the European continent.
All of Russia's proposals for European security assumed that it is not Russia that has to conform to European standards and laws. It was the West that had to compromise. Russia was to have significant influence without fitting into the existing standards of organizations. It was a vision that was distinctly asymmetrical.
I to była wizja, która nie była realna politycznie.
And that was a vision that was not politically viable, as the inability to realize that vision became more and more apparent. And this confrontation was developing due to growing Russian ambitions and, above all, a growing sense of Russia's own power, which believed that since certain things, certain influences were not given to it by agreement, then it would have to carve them out for itself through its own aggressive policies. All this actually led to the idea of this specifically understood cooperation between Russia and the West being de facto dead and buried.
In the next years of Putin's rule, the idea of imperialism and then revisionism became the flagship narratives of the Kremlin. Other concepts also moved front and center. They function as an ideological basis for legitimizing the actions of the Russian government.
Огромный русский мир, который никогда не строился исключительно и только по этническому, национальному или религиозному признаку.
One of these is the concept of the Russian world.
Po rosyjsku ruski mir, która jest taką, powiedziałabym, sztandarową.
In Russian, Ruski Mir, which I would say is the Kremlin's flagship narrative. It's a concept that was initially identified with the Kremlin's foreign policy doctrine and a soft power tool. The idea was to somehow connect and attract Russian diasporas to Russia, to use these diasporas for political purposes, to use cultural institutions of various kinds to influence the international community in a soft and friendly way, and not by force, using especially these cultural, diplomatic tools and so on. Initially, when this concept of the Russian world appeared in the narrative of Putin and his entourage, it had this dimension, i.e., it was a cultural, civilizational concept. I would say, however, that over the years it has taken on a harder dimension, a more aggressive dimension, and at this point we can call it a geopolitical concept that has basically been instrumentally used by the Kremlin to justify its aggression against Ukraine. This is a concept that specifically assumes that the countries on Soviet territory, which were created after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, are countries that should be subordinate to Russia, that are in the Russian cultural circle, especially the Orthodox countries, because an important role as an agent in this concept, an agent of the Kremlin, in this concept of the Russian world is played by the Orthodox Church. Among other things, it is used directly to sanctify the war. For example, it gives it this mystical dimension as a struggle between good and evil. Yet another concept that overlaps the concept of the Russian world is that of the Holy Rus.
Jest wykorzystywana przez władze do sakralizacji władzy państwowej, do tego, żeby...
It is used by the authorities for the realization of state power to achieve various social political goals, not only in Russia, but also internationally. The concept of Holy Rus comes back to the time when Orthodoxy appeared in the Eastern lands. Russia considers itself the defender of not only Orthodox values, but Christian values in general. The West is in decline and turning away from Christian values, and it is Russia that nurtures these Christian values in the Orthodox dimension. So this is a very effective tool in the hands of the Kremlin, and it may not be positively received in Western Europe, but I believe that in other parts of the world, in Africa or Latin America or in the Middle East, where Russia had stood up for Christian communities, these slogans are being heard, and Russia is playing them very well in terms of propaganda. And on top of these concepts, linked to religion, linked to orthodoxy, there is also a third concept, the concept of a third Rome. They are all interrelated. This concept is raised by some intellectuals around the Kremlin or associated with Orthodox Christianity, and it says that while the first Rome, or the Roman Empire, fell, then Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire fell, Russia is the heir to these very traditions of Eastern Christianity. And Russia is the only state that can now take on the title of the Third Rome. Yet another slogan that appears in addition to those mentioned is the idea of the unity of the triune Russian nation.
Brzmi to dość skomplikowanie, ale już wyjaśniam. Chodzi o to, że...
It sounds rather complicated, but I can explain. Russians, or representatives of the Russian elite, believe that the Russian nation is a very broadly understood community, and it also includes the Ukrainian nation and the Belarusian nation, and sometimes Moldova is included in this group, depending on the author of the statement. The point is that it is all one cultural community. This Russian nation is understood here in a very broad way. That is, to put it bluntly, they are all Eastern Slavs. Even today, they should be one nation and have been forcibly separated by hostile forces coming, of course, from the West. Russia is fighting to unite this nation, because its historical role is to make this nation one. These words were also stated more than once by Patriarch Kirill, who even said in his sermons that the war in Ukraine is a war for the Russian people to be united. These concepts appear primarily in the Kremlin's propaganda narrative. The main propaganda instrument is Russian state television, speeches by Vladimir Putin, Patriarch Kirill, and various government officials. These narratives include slogans about Russia's messianic role, the role of saving the world and saving Christian civilization. It is meant to reassure Russians that they are the chosen people with a great mission, and under Putin, Russia is carrying out this historic mission of saving the world from evil.
Ta mesjanistyczna narracja w rosyjskiej propagandzie idzie w takim kierunku wręcz karykaturalnym, wręcz absurdalnym.
This messianic narrative in Russian propaganda is moving towards a caricatured, almost absurd direction, because there are more and more references to the fact that Russia is fighting against Satanism, that Russia is fighting the devil. In general, the sacralization of Russia's role in the international arena is already widely present in Russian propaganda. Before that, just a few years ago, only some individual propagandists were talking about it, and these were almost extreme views. Whereas now, I can say it has gone mainstream. And this is how the Kremlin wants the Russian public to perceive these rivalries between Russia and the West, or even the conflict between Russia and the West that is playing out in relation to this conventional war that Russia has unleashed in Ukraine. These concepts linked to orthodoxy appear, for example, in the discourse offered by Alexander Dugin, a kind of ideologue, an Orthodox philosopher who has appeared quite frequently on Russian television recently. Of course, he justifies the war in Ukraine, saying that Russia is carrying out a historical mission there.
Эта война, это не только война армий, людей, это еще и война духа.
Nie tylko właśnie walki o zjednoczenie narodu.
It's not only the struggle to unite the Russian people or to save the Orthodox Church, but in general, he says that, literally, Russia is fighting Satan. And this Satan, in the understanding of Russian propaganda and Russian elites, at least part of them, is the West. The West is perceived as the greatest enemy, not only in political terms, but even in civilizational or messianic terms. The West is evil incarnated, and this has its serious social repercussions, because if we look at how Russian society relates to the West, we can see that there is a degradation of the perception of the West in Russian society. Russians perceive the West worse and worse, and indeed you can see that in this case, this propaganda is acutely effective. The West is accused of all and any evil, all of Russia's failures, all of its problems, including economic and social failures. I would even say that it has its own meme-like feature, that whatever bad thing is happening in Russia at the moment, it's the West that is responsible for everything. The West is, of course, destroying Russia and not allowing it to develop. Russians themselves are not inclined to look for failure in their own elites or in their own behavior. This is an excuse, a cop-out, and it's used instrumentally. Alongside these narratives which Russians encounter in the media or in their contacts with the authorities, there are also more down-to-earth and existential concepts that dominate everyday life. And here we need to distinguish between the concepts of imperial and ethnic nationalism, and quite simply, conformity. Imperial nationalism makes it possible to justify Russian aggression. Russia has the right to expand because it is defending Russians. It defends orthodoxy and Russian-speaking communities. At the same time, the number of ethnic Russians is declining. At the moment, 70% of the population identifies as ethnic Russian, but even this is not a reliable number, because some respondents do not submit data to the census. There is a lot of hostility between Russians and the other ethnic groups that live in the North Caucasus or the Siberian republics. The Russian vector of nationalism also has many directions. This can be seen during various conflicts or riots. The potential for ethnic hostility is high and can easily find approval and acceptance among broad sections of society. Conformity, on the other hand, while not a formalized ideology, is widespread among Russians. This is a society that does not want to be active, which does not want to contribute, which is afraid of this activity, which does not want to fight for its rights, but also, on the other hand, which would like to be comfortable, to be well off. So, if the government offers satisfying basic needs and some moderate economic growth, an increase in the standard of living, then society is satisfied. And we have observed this over more than 2 decades of Putin's rule, where he has offered society this social contract, which consisted of increasing social prosperity, slowly but nevertheless successively. In particular, the poorest and most vulnerable groups would be taken care of by the Kremlin, colloquially speaking, in return for not participating politically and not speaking out against the authorities. This has worked in Russia for many years. At the moment, we're talking about a new social contract in Russia, namely for particular groups, namely for those who are involved in the war. Welfare and various social offers from the state are reserved for them. This unfortunately also works quite well, because those groups that are important to the Kremlin from the point of view of waging war, they are quite well valued by the Kremlin. And because of this, they are quiet. They are susceptible to the Kremlin's suggestions, and they simply allow themselves to be managed, and I would even say manipulated. The conformity of Russians is one of the things that allows the Kremlin's authoritarian rule to persist. It also reinforces the authorities' conviction that society is incapable of bringing about grassroots revolutionary change. And it also believes that the so-called color revolutions could not have been just a grassroots popular uprising against authoritarian rule. Other forces had to be involved. The members of the Russian regime come from the former secret services. People full of resentment about the West, believing, for example, that it was Western conspiracy and collaboration with enemies inside Russia and the Russian Fifth Column that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now they want to do the same in the Russian Federation.
Więc mamy do czynienia z ludźmi, którzy
So we're dealing with people who, through their own views, but also through the training they've received within the secret services, are absolutely programmed to think in terms of first, threats, and second, conspiracy theories. Conspiracies, covert actions, destabilization, disintegration. This is the mental reality in which they revolve. This is a vision that not only functions in Russian propaganda, but which is really part of a certain perception of certain members of the ruling group in Russia. The same is even more true of the so-called color revolutions. They are nothing more than special operations carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. And this was a very important factor on the one hand, reinforcing authoritarian trends in Russia itself, i.e. the belief that they are doing it in neighboring countries for the time being, but they really want to do the same thing in Russia. And this is how the political manifestations in December 2011 in Russia were treated. And this political paranoia, because that's what we need to call it, led to a tightening of the authoritarian system in Russia. Their logic was that you have to defend yourself against this threat, which is both external but also internal, because there is a fifth column that collaborates with these hostile external forces. It caused Putin's Russia to find it necessary to put up resistance. Since you are taking measures to weaken us, potentially later to destroy us, we will do the same to you. And we're going to do it even more brutally, even more effectively. We're going to hit your interests. We're going to hit you directly. And that also fueled this increasingly aggressive Russian policy.
The foundation that sustains successive regimes in Russia is the Secret Service. The Federal Security Service is established in 1995. Today's FSB is still located in the former KGB headquarters on Lubyanka Street. It has between 200,000 and 350,000 officers, and former KGB officers are still among its staff. The FSB is incomparable to any other service in the West. There is no organization in Western democracies with an equally broad mandate to operate. And it is their vision of the world that dictates the Kremlin's approach to the West.
Mentalności wielu jego kolegów.
In the mentality of Putin and many of his cronies, the main task of the intelligence services is, apart from getting information, to take control of something and to manage it. And, well, that's the Russia we have today. These are people who have incorporated the experience and the way the services functioned from the Soviet system. And here the point was that the FSB's tasks, when it was all still taking shape in the 2000s, were primarily concerned with getting the economy under control. Let's remember what happened in Russia. These so-called oligarchs lost their relevance in the Russian system. It is state capitalism but managed by the court. Large corporations or branches of the economy are managed by people accepted directly by Putin, but who also have had links to various so-called power structures for years.
Perhaps apart from the Russian army, today the FSB has influence over almost every institution in the country. It conducts operations against the Russian opposition. It controls and enforces censorship. It has subjugated industry, financial institutions, administration, and even culture. Movies are reviewed by civilian officers before they are released into cinemas. FSB officers sit on the boards of companies, and citizens are jailed for publishing content online that criticizes the government. The services manage the entire work of the presidential administration. But above all, they continue to do a magnificent job of keeping the regime in power. Last year, Vladimir Putin became president for the 5th time. This creates the appearance of a stable system, especially compared to the chaos of the 1990s.
I właśnie to, że to państwo jest zarządzane w ten sposób, tak jak teraz.
And it's precisely the fact that this state is managed in this way as it is now. It seemingly gives the appearance that it's okay, it's good. It's more peaceful than it was in previous years. Do you want the return of the Yeltsin era when there was mass poverty, you couldn't buy anything? I don't think you do. So you have to accept what you have, because we are the good guys. The second decade or so after 2010 still showed that there was still some dialogue between the West and Russia. There was an attempt to build some kind of relationship. Yet very quickly the cat was out of the bag, because the Russians immediately became very assertive, but also aggressive in this relationship. They started to openly say that our condition for cooperation is to include Russia in the management of the security of the European continent, and we will have one of the decisive votes on how it will all look like, what NATO will look like. Can Poland deploy American units? No, it cannot. And this is where they began to carry out such actions to show that Russia is strong, that Russia will not give up its strategic objectives. I can't imagine that there can be democracy in Russia in such a situation when it is pursuing this kind of great power politics, which also requires the discipline of society, that society must believe in it.
Chapter 3. Russia is a state of mind. What might also be responsible for how the relations between Russia and the West look like even today is, perhaps something less clear to some, the ideological and practical differences in the political culture of these two worlds. Looking at Russia's culture, particularly in the 19th century, it is undoubtedly part of the West. And this is misleading, because Western elites think they are dealing with a partner who also thinks about politics and society in the same way as they do. In reality, this is not the case. And although the concepts of the 19th century West broke through to the Russian political elite, they never entered the popular consciousness. It's the Soviet experience that remains the most important. And it's this time and this political culture that affected the psyche of even the current political elite the most.
Society is based on a hierarchy. There is an elite that rules, and there is a society. Well, it's not actually a society. In this political culture, you rather call it a population. It's something like a paternalistic and parasitic relationship. The elite is there to live well, to rule, to suck resources out of the area and out of this population. But at the same time, this relationship is not contractual.
Simply put, we call this a social contract, whereby the government, in return for the obedience of its subjects, assumes certain obligations and the fulfillment of the promises given to them. If the government breaches this contract and fails to honor these assurances, the people are released from their obligation to obey. In very simplistic terms, current democracies still operate on this principle. If a government fails to meet its demands, through elections, it can lose the privilege of ruling. In Russia, however, things are different.
To, co na Ukrainie widzieliśmy, Majdany były takim przykładem.
What we saw in Ukraine, the Maidans, were such an example. In Russia, this is unthinkable. There is no situation in which obedience to authority can be terminated. There is an absolutely one-sided relationship here.
Russia is also distinguished from the West by the presence of its oligarchs. At one time, their influence on politics was significant. Today, however, they no longer decide the shape of the Russian state.
Członkowie elity do tego stopnia nie dowierzają sobie.
Members of the elite don't trust each other to the extent that they actually feel better in a situation where there is one arbiter, one czar, in this case Putin, whose main role is to make sure that there is a balance between those jumping down each other's throats and fighting for resources among the various clans, groups, and different interest groups. There were reports from those few days when it seemed that Prigozhin might take Moscow, supposedly members of the Russian elite, not the highest elite, but just the kind of people who have some houses, property. They started pulling out their guns and sort of preparing to defend themselves, because if the system collapses, the mob will come here and do us in. These are reminiscences of 1917, you could say, that the mob will come here and rob us, and we have to defend ourselves. And this is also the result of a distinct mindset. Again, I would contrast the traditional approach here with an Enlightenment approach, as it is written in the US Constitution, that the goal of the political system there is the pursuit of happiness and the realization of aspirations and dreams. Well, no. In this system, the goal is survival. That is, we look at politics as a choice of the lesser of two evils, not as an attempt to realize some much less public good.
An integral part of the mentality of the Russian political elite is conspiracy thinking. Nothing is what it seems. Everything is a facade. There are always behind-the-scenes forces, a group that pulls the strings, and spontaneous social processes do not exist. One can look at this as a certain transfer of one's own experience to other countries. This is what it's like in Russia, so it must be the same for everyone else. The actions of the Russian authorities reflect just such a vision of the world.
Społeczeństwo rosyjskie może zbuntować się tylko pod wpływem
Russian society can only rebel under the influence of Western inspiration, and if we, the elite, are to be safe, we must first cut this society off from Western inspiration, and then weaken this Western side to the point where it does not inspire or aspire to influence us, even by the very fact of its existence. In that sense, the West is a mortal danger not by what it does, but by what it is.
We already know how the Russian elite and media portray the West. Russia is a refuge of the traditional conservative Christian values of European civilization, which Western Europe has betrayed. This ideology has been manufactured over the last 20 years by the Russian elite and legitimizes the actions of the authorities. The rejection of post-war liberal democracy is the foundation of Putin's new ideology. It's based on the rejection of certain values and on negative reference points, but it does not say what it positively stands for. We know what Russia wants to fight against in the name of this pseudo-conservatism, but we don't really know what it wants to fight for. We can infer this from the real actions of the Russian authorities, and these real actions tell us about the values that are contrary to conservatism. For example, that conservatism is the idea of evolution. Conservatism does not like revolution. Conservatism believes in evolutionary, peaceful, organic change. If we say that the symbol of revolution is the flame, then conservatism carries the candle of evolution. As for Putinism, I would say it's sitting by the extinct ashes of a fire and is poking at them with a stick. In Russia, there is no well-established tradition that can in fact be preserved, because historical experience, especially in the 20th century, has meant that there is no national consensus on the key elements of identity, beyond the empire and beyond the mythologized Soviet Union. The memory of the Soviet Union itself has little to do with what really happened during that time. It has been embellished and manipulated. And in fact, the only element on which there is general agreement, that is an important and key event in history, is the Great Patriotic War against Nazi Germany. There is no other event, no other historical tradition which can be agreed upon in society as one of the key elements of its identity. Despite the efforts of the authorities in the 1990s, no new identity project has been invented in Russia. Consequently, the easiest way to consolidate the nation around power is to appeal to a strong state, which everyone abroad fears, and to a strong government as such a keystone for the nation, as a reference point for a contemporary historical identity. Going further, war, which is the so-called patriotic project of the Kremlin, breaks up families. The idea of a family is also the basis of conservative values. For a totalitarian or a neo-totalitarian system like Putinism, a strong family is in fact a threat. A strong family is an alternative to this system that the authorities want to create, a system in which the only point of reference for the citizen is the ruler, is the leader, whose power is de facto sacralized. In Russia, the divorce rate is very high, and I would say that abortion and divorce are really probably the only traditional values to which Russians as a society are attached to: the right to abortion and the right to an easy divorce. This has been formed over many decades, and attempts to take away these rights are seen as very controversial by society itself. In fact, this pseudo-conservative identity project is cynically instrumental in justifying that strong, hierarchical, oppressive power is something supposedly natural and organic to Russia, and that it should remain that way, that any other values and any other model of government will be destructive to Russian identity, spirituality, the future of the state, and for Russian statehood, that it will destroy the state and destroy the nation, and this is supposed to echo a completely manufactured threat. This fear is supposed to force society to consolidate around the authorities. One of the elements that determine the specific nature of the Russian political system is its system of patronage, in Russian, krysha. The more powerful patron someone has in power, the more freely they can exploit the opportunities the system provides, take advantage of various corruption schemes, and more importantly, feel protected in doing so. Violence can be used against others with impunity to maximize influence or wealth. The average citizen, on the other hand, feels that the state is oppressive and can violate their rights and use violence at any time. My understanding of this is that it's a domino of violence that trickles down from the top to the bottom, meaning that the state, which is highly violent against citizens, makes sure that those citizens can take it out on those who are weaker than them. It's a kind of fuse, so that the citizen does not turn against the state, but to those whom it can again persecute with impunity. In the view of the Kremlin and the Russian administration, the greatest threat to Russia's security is liberal democracy. Every time the authorities stopped controlling society, especially when the economic situation improved, people wanted more. They wanted a different Russia. The last time this happened, in 2011 and 2012, we see a clear turn in the Kremlin's policy. This is when Putin personally makes the decision. He decides that this is the end of democratic experiments. Now we have to make sure that there are no color revolutions, that there is no turbulence. We must present the nation with such a project according to which there is an organic harmony between power and society, a harmony of needs, a harmony of interests, a harmony of values, and all expressions of discontent are inspired from the outside, generally by Western secret services, and mainly by American secret services. Personal connections play a dominant role in the Russian political system, and the system that Vladimir Putin has created can be described as a personalist dictatorship. In this system, there is no mechanism for transferring power that is safe for the leader. Power in Russia is equated not only with material status, but also with physical security. There is a fear among those in power that because power is everything, and lack of power can end in physical elimination, then as long as we are the rulers and in control, not only will we live out our days in extravagant wealth and in peace, but we will also pass it on to our children. And we see in Russia a slow process of passing on resources and influence to the next generation of the elites. This is not yet happening on a large scale, but we can see the aspiration. There is even a saying that the Russian rebellion is senseless and cruel. There is a fear of the popular masses breaking off, going to the barricades and overthrowing the government in a forceful and bloody way. This, of course, is very difficult to explain. This perception of society is very ambivalent. On the one hand, the authorities manipulate and intimidate society quite brutally. On the other hand, there is this fear of a color revolution and that we might lose this power. This is also a mafia mentality, that I either lead a criminal group in a ruthless way, I intimidate and manifest my brutality, or if there is a younger, stronger wolf than me in this pack, then he won't just finish me off. I will lose everything I have and he will finish off my entire family. And now, how to reverse this process? How to detoxify Russia after years of such a narrative, after the normalization of war and violence? This is a big mystery and a very important question for the future. Darwinist terms. The world is an arena where states and nations fight for survival. In this struggle, only the strongest will survive, including in the international arena. The great powers are at the forefront. They set the rules for how the world works. But at the same time, the rules they created do not apply to them. And while Russia would like to be seen as such a great power, the Russian authorities know that a return to a bipolar world, as it was under the United States and the Soviet Union, is no longer possible.
Realny jest ład z nazwy wielobiegunowy, bo to jest ta formalna.
What is foreseeable is a multipolar order. That is the formal name that Russia uses, a polycentric order in which, of course, Russia is supposed to be one of the centers. But in reality, the Russians seem to have decided that the actual order that is taking shape now is one centered around China. That is, the dominant feature of the current international situation is the rival between the diminishing and eroding order based on the dominance of the United States and the West focused around them, and the emerging new power in the form of China and the networks it is creating, based primarily on the countries of the so-called Global South. And without the subjugation of Ukraine, followed by strategic control over other states in the region that are significant for Russia, and without breaking the existing Western structures, weakening them, eroding them, and without penetrating Europe politically, economically, probably already in cooperation with China, without these, Russia will not be able to realize this primary goal. This goal is to change the global order and secure a proper place in it before Russia is weakened by long-term trends involving energy, technology, and economic model efficiency issues, or their demographic or climate change challenges.
Russian interests are therefore irreconcilable with those of the Western states. Only a fundamental political transformation of Russia could change this. Not just Putin's departure, but a deeper change in the rules of the system. It's not even a question of Russia becoming like other Western democracies. That would be an unrealistic, delusional view. Russia would have to become a state that accepts at least the basic principles of the rule of law and political pluralism. It would have to pursue a policy of modernizing its own state instead of an aggressive external policy. And this would mean at least normalizing relations with its neighbors, and a pragmatic policy in which there is room for cooperation with the West. How realistic is this vision?
Można powiedzieć, że to jest pewna utopia.
One could say that this is a certain utopia, because it seems that in the foreseeable future, of course, at this point, there is no chance that this state could be reached. What would have to happen to theoretically create such a chance would be some great trauma and a great crisis comparable to what has happened several times in the last 100 years of Russian history. These things are not impossible. They have happened before in Russia, and they can happen again. This is either the loss of a major war or a deep crisis, a very deep internal crisis, and one could be related to the other, which would ultimately lead to such a fundamental political change. Therefore, in order to create the conditions to increase the potential chances of these scenarios, which are favorable from the point of view of Western states, in my opinion, the key thing is to bring about the defeat of Russia in the current war in Ukraine. Without this system will survive. Even if it does not consolidate, it will conserve itself and may for decades to come still carry out a policy harmful not only to Western countries, not only to its neighbors, but to the Russians themselves, a policy fraught with enormous human suffering, including of the Russians themselves.
If regime change does occur, what can we expect? Certainly not extreme scenarios, such as the breakup of Russia or a sudden democratization of the system along the lines of Western democracies. So, what might happen?
Nawet w przypadku głębokiego kryzysu w Rosji,
even in the event of a deep crisis in Russia, we will rather deal with a certain process of decentralization of the state, perhaps in places reminiscent of elements of the situation in the 90s. But there are too many factors that cause Russia to remain a whole state. This is both the weakness of regional elites, the very strong economic ties and dependencies. These are a whole range of objective factors that mean that there are no strong separatist tendencies in Russia, and there are also no serious reasons to talk about the scenario of a breakup of the state, even in the event of a weakening of the central power. Rather, we are talking about positive scenarios of a de facto re-federalization of Russia, that is, a return to living up to the name of the Russian Federation, with real meaning. Today, Russia is a unitary state, contrary to its name, and highly centralized. The idea would be, and it seems such a scenario would be possible under certain circumstances, for Russia to once again become a federation in reality, not just in name. The other extreme scenario, in a sense, is some vision of a great democratization of Russia, that proponents of liberal democracy come to power and put Russia on the path of a great transformation, leading to friendly cooperation and even integration with the West. And this too is a very utopian vision. As we have already discussed, centuries of historical baggage, profound changes, and the lasting traces they have left in the mentality of the people, the various traumas Russian society has experienced, the massive propaganda and brainwashing to which the society has been subjected for many, many years, especially recently, will make it unlikely that this scenario, the most positive one from the point of view of the West, will take place. Therefore, instead of thinking about how to make concessions to Putin's Russia, or how to create an offer for a post-Putin Russia, which it is far too early for, at this point we should focus on how to weaken, how to harm, and how to defeat Putin's Russia.